Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, 6 Years Later, the State of Pennsylvania Land Banks. This webinar today is being hosted by John Kromer. John Kromer is a housing and development consultant who specializes in strategic planning, public agency capacity building, and program and policy development for urban communities and metropolitan regions. Today's webinar is a sneak preview to the Housing Alliance's report that will be released at our annual Homes Within Reach conference on October 29th, which will discuss the work being done to address blight and vacant properties in Pennsylvania. Thank you, John, for joining us. I'm going to hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I also want to ask George Connor, who's on the call, to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Yes, hello. It's George Connor, Executive Director of the Dauphin County Economic Development Department, and also Executive Director of our Dauphin County Land Bank Authority.
Great. Thank you. We're expecting Irene Clark from the Pittsburgh Land Bank to be joining us shortly, but we will press ahead now with some background information that I'll provide, and then George will jump in and describe Dauphin County's experience. So here we go. A lot of you are well aware of how serious the problem of blight is across Pennsylvania, and about the fact that for a long time it has been a widespread problem, not limited to urban areas. And to some extent, the problem worsened during the early part of this century, the years leading up to and after the recession. And during this period, although land banks had existed in the 20th century, they really began to proliferate during the first decade of the 21st century and within the past few years, in part because of the work of the Center for Community Progress, a national organization that really made the promotion of land banks and training and information sharing about land banks widely available on a national level. In Pennsylvania, Frank Alexander, a law professor from Emory, who's probably the world's leading expert on land bank legal and legislative issues, and Kim Graziani, formerly from the Pittsburgh City Administration, were instrumental in working with the Housing Alliance and others in promoting discussions about land banks and opportunities for land banks in Pennsylvania. And after some very extensive discussions, the land bank enabling legislation was approved at the end of 2012. There's a lot of information about the legislation, as well as a lot of other documentation from land banks that have established themselves that you can find on the Housing Alliance's website in the PA Blight Library. There are incorporation documents and bylaws and policy and practice documents. So there's really a lot of information about associated with documenting land banks in Pennsylvania that I think many have found useful in sort of replicating or drawing on the experience of others. So you're probably well aware that a land bank can do a lot of different things, and I think the intent of the drafters of the legislation was to be as expansive as possible, so that there would be no need to go back and amend constantly. So the legislation provides for, the following roles, among others. Number one, being sort of a center of decision-making and policy-making on real estate transactions, a place where publicly owned properties, surplus properties, can be marketed for appropriate reuses. In some cases, if that's a priority in the jurisdiction where the land bank has been established, the land bank is a real estate developer. It acquires properties and tears down deteriorated buildings, does new construction, rehabilitation, so on. And then finally, a land bank can be a funding source that applies for and obtains financing, and in some cases serves as a kind of pass-through to local municipalities that need assistance with blight-related problems but don't have the capacity to deal with those problems by themselves. So these roles aren't mandatory, they're optional, and some land banks that have been created so far have been very expansive in taking on a number of these roles. Others have had a very narrow focus and have been more comfortable with a very specialized role. So it's really a decision that should be made by the organizers in each case. The legislation enumerates a lot of different activities which are can be performed by a land bank, and you'll see in reading over the legislation that a lot of those activities are already available through the use of existing public powers. But there are two unique powers that are specific to land banks that those existing agencies don't have. Number one, the ability to extinguish property tax liens from the title of a tax delinquent property so that you can produce a clear title. And then the ability to acquire a property at the so-called free and clear sale or the judicial tax sale, at which tax delinquent properties are auctioned without the need to compete against others who show up at the public auction. Just the ability to submit a bid and to have that bid accepted by the Tax Claim Bureau or the auctioneer without opening up to additional bids. So the caveat, however, is that no land bank can exercise these powers unilaterally. They're dependent on approvals by other agencies that need to be involved in the process. Number one, the taxing authorities, local, county, school district, have to sign off on a land bank's use of these powers. And that's a very appropriate check on the scope of land bank activity and really provides assurance that a land bank isn't going to become a runaway authority that's going to go its own way and make these decisions that aren't consistent with the policies and practices that governments have established. Frequently, it takes a long time for a land bank to get established, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Dauphin County wasn't one of those, as George will tell you a little bit later. They came out of the gate right away after the approval of the legislation. But in some cases, it takes several years for a land bank to get created. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing because you've got to work out some coordination and cooperation issues, frequently those that exist between municipalities and counties, and in some cases between agencies that haven't had working relationships before. And in addition, you want to have a public process, and during that process, all kinds of questions come up about land banks that you need to address, such as the following. Why do we need a land bank? We have a redevelopment authority already. And, the answer relates to these two unique powers. However, as some of you are aware, legislation recently approved makes it possible for a redevelopment authority to become a land bank, and in some instances, I think municipal and county jurisdictions will want to follow up in that manner. I'm not aware of any existing land banks that want to make changes in their plans based on that legislation, but the legislation is fairly recent, so we'll see what happens. And then the question about displacement. Are people going to be thrown out of their properties because the land bank took it over? Will the land bank develop Section 8 housing and bring in, low-income renters in places that already have a high concentration of low-income housing? And again, the land bank is a tool. It's not a new government entity or a new policy that fundamentally changes the way government operates, and it really can't do anything without the authorization of the existing government agencies that need to be involved in transactions like this. And then the question of, at the tax sale auction, will the land bank cherry pick the best properties that could have been marketed privately and developed by the private real estate industry without the need for government being involved? And that's been an issue in some of the Midwestern states where land banks have received a lot of funding from government sources that we don't have access to, and have really played an ambitious development role, and in some cases have been challenged by the real estate industry. To my knowledge, this hasn't been a really significant issue in Pennsylvania, although it has come up. And I think the reason for this is that the land banks that exist now really are aiming at the worst properties, the worst case properties that will never be addressed through private market intervention and that need some special action in order to demolish the property or repurpose it appropriately. So although this is a concern that needs to be addressed, I don't think that it's been a major issue in Pennsylvania, which is great. And then finally, you, the land bank, want to erase the tax liens from the title of certain properties. Isn't this depriving the city and school district or the county of tax revenue that's desperately needed? And I think the dialogue has to focus on frequently the fact that the properties that land banks are talking about are never going to be paying their taxes for various reasons. The owner is deceased, the business that owned it is bankrupt or out of business, it closed down, or for other reasons that are going to make it impossible to ever collect on those delinquent taxes. And to make the argument that the land bank's activity in clearing the title and getting those properties back into the real estate market is going to relatively quickly generate new tax revenues, and that's what it's all about. But that's a dialogue, and responding to those questions requires a dialogue that can take some time, and I think that's one of the reasons why some land bank planning can go on and on. But the good news, in my opinion, is these questions by and large get resolved. We're not hearing about these deadlocks where, there's a big fight that's breaking out over the land banks. There are problems, and there have been roadblocks that have made it difficult to get the approvals that are needed. But my sense, at least, and I've been around, is that there's an openness to the discussion and the debate, and that in most cases these issues get dealt with and addressed, which is great. So 6 years later, 20 land banks have been incorporated in Pennsylvania. Some of you know the Johnny Cash song, I've Been Everywhere. Maybe there's an opportunity to do something similar here with all these names. That's up to you, but that might be a good music video. And then there are two land bank organizing projects that are underway. City of Altoona, City of Sharon in Mercer County. And they're in the midst of an organizing and planning initiative, which we hope will result in the creation of a land bank. There may be others that are underway in Pennsylvania. Please let us know if you know of any, and we'd love to follow up if it would be helpful in terms of providing information and technical support for these planning efforts. So there's a wide variety of land banks. We'll talk about a few specific examples. Some of them are extremely active. They have professional staff that are working on real estate transactions every day. And in the case of several land banks, and not just urban land banks, the board is meeting every month because they need to keep up with the need to review property transaction proposals and to authorize the property settlements and the award of properties to selected developers. So that's the good news. There's a lot of activity, and that activity is not limited to only certain types of areas. It's happening on a broad scale. So with that, I'd like to ask George just to talk a little bit about Dauphin County and how that got started and what has been going on since the land bank was established.
Yeah, we started our land bank back in 2013, and we were lucky enough to start the first land bank in the state of Pennsylvania. And we went through some struggles trying to get everything started, but the long story short, our first project, we partnered with our prison system they had created a program called Project Trade for nonviolent offenders, basically to teach them a trade. And on our first project, we purchased a house that was for sale on the market. It was needed some work. It was a blighted structure, but it was for sale. And our commissioners, Dauphin County commissioners, awarded us gaming grant dollars. So we're fortunate enough to have that funding source for our land bank. They awarded us some grant dollars. We purchased the house for, I think, like $70,000. It was a single-family rancher, 3-bedroom rancher. We worked with our Project Trade program and went in, bought the supplies. All the labor, of course, was free. And then we sold the house for about $129,000. So we made some money on that project. And then our next project was fire-damaged structures that became a dumping ground on a certain part of our community out in Susquehanna Township off of the Susquehanna River. And we went in, and when we identified these structures from the municipality, we found 400 tires, 20 rolls of carpet, and just debris and trash in these structures. We went in and demolished the houses. We removed all the blight from the structure, and we built 5 new brand new townhomes. We just recently sold those back in I think December. So that was a great project for us, and by us investing those dollars in that particular area, other investors came in and purchased some blighted structures down the street, renovated those. So we really changed the makeup of that community in that one little section of Susquehanna Township there. So it was a really, really great project. And I won't get into the details, but our last project that we've been working on is in Stilton, Pennsylvania, which is a low-income community in Dauphin County, and we partnered with Habitat for Humanity, which this was a great partnership in the sense that the borough owned a structure that was vacant and blighted for over 15 years. They deeded it over to the land bank. We partnered with Habitat, and basically they brought their volunteers in and renovated the houses. And once again, our county commissioners were fortunate enough to grant us gaming dollars for material costs. We're currently working on the house now to renovate it, and a sweat equity volunteer then will purchase the house when they're completed with the renovations to it. So that's just a great project right there.
Great. And if a municipality is interested in getting assistance from the land bank, what's the nature of the agreement, the cooperation agreement that gets signed? What do they have to be responsible for, and what does the land bank offer to do?
Well, initially, and that's a good point, John. Initially, that was the struggles that we did have. Was we had to go out and physically meet with. Well, you start with the school district first, and a lot of school district board members are obviously their number one goal and mission is education. So and their main means of revenue are taxes. So when you go in to talk to them, basically, when you start talking about tax forgiveness, splitting the taxes for 5 years, 50%. A lot of them, can't understand that concept and don't really want to give the taxes up. But when you go in and you talk about structures that currently aren't paying any taxes and you're not receiving any revenue from it, and you talk about renovating a structure that is going to uplift the prices of the houses currently around it, then they kind of start to understand what we're trying to do. And that's kind of how it was easier for us to get the memorandum of understanding signed with these school boards. The municipalities weren't so hard. I mean, they get it. They know that they have blighted structures that need to be renovated in their municipality, and they welcome the assistance from the land bank. It's more of the school district that you have to struggle with about trying to explain to them how the process works, and you're there to help them. And by partnering with them and having those guys sign that agreement, then, they're going to get projects done. And in the future, their tax base is going to go up from you identifying those deficient structures that aren't currently bringing in revenue to the township or community.
For those first two properties, are those properties now back on the tax rolls, or
yes.
are they still? Great. Well, we should probably get the dollars and cents there, because that might be a helpful example for other communities.
Okay. Yeah,
Great.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, good. So that proves your point. You've got two good examples of that.
Yes, we did.
And what was the reaction of the county commissioners when the issue of the land bank first came up?
Oh, our county commissioners are very progressive in the sense that, you know, they want to, when something comes out that's going to be beneficial and affect the residents in a positive way, they want to get it done. And, you know, that's kind of how we are. We want to be in the forefront of anything that's new and creative and something that's going to be beneficial to the community. So they wanted us to get this started. And one thing I didn't mention was the demo fund. When Governor Wolf enacted the demolition fund fees, we were right on it and went in and explained the situation and how it was going to work. And we enacted that back in March of 2017, and we now have over $361,000 in our demo fund. So that's been very successful as well. So
great. We'll have questions and comments later, but I just see one question that came up that relates to a slide from a couple of minutes ago that I think would be worth answering now, and that was, given that redevelopment authorities now have, you know, can become land banks, is there any reason for new land banks to be formed in Pennsylvania? You know, you could just make the redevelopment authority a land bank. And I think the answer to that question is yes, and we can have some more discussion about that later on. But in some instances, there is no active redevelopment authority, you know, in a county government, or in other instances, there is a redevelopment authority, but, and I've heard this, the feeling is, you know, we have a structure, there's certain things that we do, we have a scope of activity, and this land bank is a little different. We're already busy doing our thing, and we just as soon have a separate entity that works on the land bank issues. In some cases, there is an existing redevelopment authority, but a municipality or a group of municipalities at the local level really don't have a working relationship with the county redevelopment authority, not through the fault of anyone, but just because the redevelopment authority is focusing on other areas of activity or other locations, and so there is an opportunity for a municipality or a group of municipalities to create a land bank in that instance. So I think the legislation may be helpful in some instances, but I don't think it means that there will be no more land banks in Pennsylvania, because everything will be done through redevelopment authorities. I'll be interested in other comments on this topic if some of you are interested in some further discussion. Let me just show you some information about three land banks that are doing very different applications of the enabling legislation. I think it's really interesting. Many of you have probably heard about the experience of Westmoreland County, which got started very soon after the approval of the land bank legislation, and very quickly jumped into a project involving an abandoned private medical facility on Route 61 and out in southwestern Pennsylvania. The facility closed in 2006. It had failed multiple state reviews, and the land bank purchased the property in 2014 for about $15,000. And then worked with the county's Industrial Development Corporation to get the environmental cleanup done. There's loads of asbestos on the site, and to demolish the existing building. And I think the fact that this was a land bank that was administered by the County Redevelopment Authority, which already had a working relationship with the Industrial Development Corporation, really was a plus, so that they were able to assign the appropriate roles in following up on this issue, which was a county government priority. The land bank's existence just facilitated the acquisition process and made it possible to move this process ahead faster than would otherwise have been the case. But the site got cleared, and the land bank issued a request for proposals. It got 3 proposals. A local developer was selected, and a retail and office center is going to be developed on the site. Pretty good. It was hard work, and it's not over yet, but the land bank really played a central role as kind of a development coordinator and project manager, and the existing skills and expertise of Averill Kopis and the Redevelopment Authority staff really were a plus in this case. George had mentioned this previously, but you'll see that last paragraph. The enabling legislation provides that the land for properties that the land bank acquires and conveys that are put into private ownership, half of the real estate tax proceeds that are generated by that repurposed property will go to the land bank following the completion of construction. And so that's allowed for in the land bank enabling legislation. A lot of properties that land banks transact are going to be, vacant lots that become side yards. That's not going to generate a wealth of revenue to the land bank. On the other hand, a major property like this one is going to be a good source of funding for the land bank. And in addition, although one vacant lot isn't going to balance the land bank's budget, you'll see some land banks are being successful in moving lots of vacant lots along, and so they will benefit in that way. Westmoreland County, on a smaller scale, got involved in a project known as Seeds of Change. It's in the city of Jeannette, and it's a partnership with Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful, which is a state affiliate of the Keep America Beautiful organization, and they received a small grant to work with the city and a group of residents in the city to deal with a problem property. With that grant and some other funding, they were able to tear down 2 vacant properties, consolidate a site, remove the debris and trash that had collected on the site, and with the assistance of a local nonprofit, support the installation of raised bed vegetable gardens at that location, working with the local nonprofit Jeannette Green Spaces. So that on a smaller scale has been very successful, and I think there are probably other opportunities to do similar projects. There may also be opportunities to coordinate with Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful. It's an organization that has a staff. They have a very sophisticated understanding of some of the problems that land banks are encountering. And there just may be more opportunities for collaborations of this kind in the future. So I think that would be a good thing to keep in mind. In Lackawanna County, the circumstances have been a little bit different, and the land bank's focus has been different as well. The real issue involves smaller properties that have really proliferated in the county, particularly in the city of Scranton, over the years. The land bank was started in 2015, and their priority really has been to look at vacant properties that didn't sell at the tax sale auctions over the years. The result of that has been that there are lots and lots of small, scattered vacant properties, most of them in the city, others in other parts of the county. And the idea was to identify 100 properties initially, 100 properties that might be most marketable, particularly for side yards, but not exclusively that. But with respect to side yards, offer them to adjacent owners at $100 each. But these 100 properties also included properties that were suitable for rehabilitation, some properties that needed to be demolished, and a brownfield site. So it wasn't just a side yard program. So moving along and putting signs on those lots and making inquiries to adjacent owners, the land bank started getting some business, and it wasn't long before the land bank board had to meet on a monthly basis. And by the end of this past summer, they sold 65 properties with another 17 in the pipeline, and they've introduced another phase of activity. So, in a place like Scranton, where these properties have sat for a long time, this is a pretty good start, and sort of suggests that with some more active marketing, there may be some opportunities that, again, in the aggregate, are going to start to make a difference in the landscape. And in May, there was a celebration of the sale of the 50th property, which happened to be a vacant house that a couple that owned a business across the street decided to rehabilitate for ground floor retail, and were considering moving upstairs after the upstairs portion was rehabilitated as well. So one thing leads to another, and that seems to have been working very effectively in Lackawanna County. One thing to remember about the tax sale process is that when there's no bidder at the judicial tax sale, the property is assigned to the repository list, and the property is available for sale through a response to an offer that's made to the Tax Claim Bureau. So these repository lists can be quite long, as was the case in Lackawanna County and Scranton, and the list is frequently posted online. The Tax Claim Bureau is always available to respond to inquiries and offers to purchase. But the Tax Claim Bureau really is not in business to sell real estate. It's not a real estate marketing agency. They're busy collecting taxes. And so I think the sort of secret to the success of the Lackawanna County Land Bank was marketing properties that had previously been available, but which adjacent owners and others may not have been aware of. So that's an interesting alternative model. And then in Venango County, the land bank, again, got started quickly and really focused on vacant structures, vacant properties that were isolated and had been long-term vacants, and making decisions in concert with local municipalities about either rehabilitating them or getting rid of them, demolishing them. Land Bank was incorporated in 2014. Vacant houses was the major concern, and finding appropriate developers and owners was the activity that they decided was going to be made a priority. And again, because Venango County has a relatively small county government, it wasn't hard for the county commissioners to determine how a land bank would work in concert with the Tax Claim Bureau, and it, at a fairly early stage, decided that at every annual judicial tax sale, the land bank would identify properties that it wanted to acquire and convey. And the approach that they took was that when the tax sale list was published, the land bank would be open to considering requests from municipalities in the county that wanted to do something about one or more of the properties on the list. And then if a property was selected, the land bank would acquire it at the judicial tax sale, again through this individual bid process where the land bank bid would be accepted and no competing bids would be considered. And then the land bank would immediately acquire the property and convey it to the interested municipality right away. There would be no holding period. It would just move that property into local control, and from that point on, the municipality would be responsible. So in 2016, 6 properties got transacted. They doubled that number in 2017. And again, this is a rural county, and a property that's in a highly visible location or in one of the municipal areas or in a retail block can be a huge problem. And so being able to strategically target these properties and do something about them through intervention at the tax sale is really starting to make a difference. So again, the municipality can request land bank action but once the transaction is completed, the municipality is responsible for maintaining the property and for anything else that happens on it. But the land bank has been helpful in getting funding for demolition and rehabilitation. It got Housing Trust Fund money, and it made use, as Dauphin County did, of Act 152, the ability to impose a deed recording fee that would become a source of funding for demolition and blight removal, and that's been very helpful. Oil City and Pennzoil are part of the story of Venango County. The real estate market is gradually improving, and the work that the land bank is doing, I think, is going to be a factor in making that improvement continue. So just a couple of comments, and then we'll move to questions and comments from you guys. I think although progress is slow in many areas of Pennsylvania, the real estate market is improving. There's more interest on the part of investors. Some of those investors have great intentions. Some of them don't. And there's a real opportunity to identify people who want to move to or invest in or develop properties in areas that we care about, and to attract the right kind of real estate activity. The biggest problem, I think, or challenge really, is to find a way to monitor and manage the tax sale process and code enforcement so that we can be welcoming new development and welcoming investment from outside without constraining activity on the part of investors and developers, but at the same time have the ability to take action where needed to deal with negligent absentee owners and speculators. That's a trick, and that issue and that challenge is one of the policy issues that the Housing Alliance will be taking on and considering in a dialogue later this month. And as any of you who are familiar with the land banks know, the biggest overriding challenge, and I believe many of you share this opinion, is the need for a dedicated source of funding to support land bank operations. Other states have it, as I mentioned, through government programs, federal programs that aren't available to Pennsylvania. The land banks that do exist have done a great job with the resources available, but to the extent that funding becomes available, or more funding or dedicated funding becomes available, then you'll see more accomplishments. So we can then move along with questions or comments. George, anything to wrap up on your end before we go there?
Yeah, I mean, I know you had mentioned about, you know, the new legislation with providing redevelopment authorities with additional power to do land bank activities. And our land bank board, and that's one thing too about the land banks, you know, for anyone on the call, you need to make sure that you have experienced people on your land bank board so that they're effective and in the sense of, you know, the projects that you select. But our board met last month, and we discussed about combining the two, but what we found out was that you still have to keep the duties separated, in the sense that you will still have to keep, you know, land bank payments separate from redevelopment authority payments and invoices and things of that nature. So with that being said, we're probably just going to keep them separated and not combine them. We just didn't feel it was effective to have them both under one, because everything still needs to be separated, rather, you know, separate audits, separate, you know, attorneys and things of that nature. So.
Great. And I understand Irene Clark from Pittsburgh is now on the line.
I am.
Excellent. Great. Could you spend a few minutes just describing the Pittsburgh Land Bank and how it got started and what has been going on, particularly in the last year during the strategic planning phase?
Absolutely. Well, it seems that Pittsburgh is kind of on the other end of the spectrum from Dauphin and the others that you've highlighted through the webinar. So, yeah, I'm glad to explain that even while there may not be a whole lot of really tangible projects happening, a land bank can still be information and getting to a place where it's going to be the most effective and efficient it can be within the system. And that's what I love about the Land Bank Act. It is so flexible to the locality and what needs to be done to have this new entity come in and do the work. So Pittsburgh did pass an ordinance. It was back in 2014, but it was quite acrimonious. There was a lot of public attention. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Oh, good. Okay. I just heard beeping, so I wanted to check in. And even when it was passed, there was a lot of skepticism. But the ordinance was heavily amended by various council member perspectives that to primarily include lots of public participation processes in the land bank activities. And the board wasn't even seated immediately. But in the meanwhile, there was a tremendous amount of background work being done just on the entire city of Pittsburgh, including its urban redevelopment authority as the long-term, very sophisticated economic development partner of Pittsburgh, to figure out all the different agencies that touch property and what's the best lane for the land bank. So there is now this land recycling handbook that really breaks down the entire system and all of its different pieces and makes recommendations about how those pieces can act more effectively. And then the Pittsburgh Land Bank Board was seated. It did come online truly in terms of taking action in about 2016 and got right into an ordinance created or required public participation process for the development of the land bank policies and procedures. And that was completed in 2017. Very robust process. We had online ability to review draft policies and to comment on them. We had 5 meetings around each of the different areas of Pittsburgh. Funding came along, including funding from the city. The city council and the mayor did include a line item for funding the land bank just for this year, for 2018. And yes, now we are currently working with a strategic plan, and that plan is really allowing for a slow walk into property transactions that will allow us to really pilot the recommendations of the Land Recycling Handbook and Pittsburgh Land Bank's role in that, so that we can develop standard operating procedures which, over the long haul, should make the system much more efficient than it's ever been. But it has taken a while, and I've learned here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, you've got to take a long view, but there's still tremendous work going on to do the systems change that has really been necessary.
Great. Thank you. I've noticed the land bank has a website. The strategic plan is on the website, and there's a lot of other stuff there, but I found the strategic plan really helpful. Unlike other plan documents that I've seen, it's very precise, it's very clear. You can get an understanding of how transactions work, and I think that's a great model for other places.
Thank you.
And in terms of property transactions, what's going to happen next? Is there a sort of priority activity that's the land bank is going to begin with in terms of acquiring properties or reviewing property proposals?
Yeah. Well, the land bank did just approve the City of Pittsburgh's request that the Pittsburgh Land Bank take a particular 10,000 square foot vacant piece of land in one of our hardest hit neighborhoods over the years. The Lincoln-Larimer neighborhood has been tremendously disinvested. So it was exciting to have the leadership of the Pittsburgh Council and Mayor say, okay, the land bank is fully operational. Let's transact on this property to get things moving. So that was approved in terms of receiving the acquisition. And we need, Pittsburgh has been land banking for decades. They have had a property reserve system, which has had a lot of activity by community development corporations that serve different geographic areas throughout Pittsburgh. So there's a lot of community interest in this particular property, in this particular neighborhood, and we need to walk through and be very transparent about what's happening. There's already confusion about the land bank already having made a decision for who's going to buy that piece of property. And that's not actually happened yet. We've only approved the acquisition, and now we've got to do what we've been anticipating for a long time, kind of switch the gears and the driver of our quieting title process from the city law department to the Pittsburgh Land Bank, while still very much coordinating with the land bank, with the city law department, as well as their real estate division within the Department of Finance. So it's a fairly complicated system. But the strategic plan, as you were indicating, anticipates that through the end of 2018 and into 2019, we're going to be identifying properties that have been taken through that property reserve process by the city at its own unique second-class cities treasurer's sale, and try to move them to the private market in a more efficient way than, and hopefully timely way, than the city has just been able to do, because really, the main idea of land banking is that it is a single purpose entity, and most municipalities, being very general purpose entities, just haven't been able to put the focus and resources into this real estate stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And then in the feedback box, I saw a message from Winnie Branton that says that last night in Altoona, City Council introduced an ordinance to designate the Altoona Redevelopment Authority as its land bank. So more to come on that.
All right.
I think we have a few minutes for any questions or comments.
Yes, and if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask over the phone, please feel free to unmute your line by pressing *7 on your phone keypad. I did see one that just came in. Joe asked, could you talk about the status of the Philadelphia Land Bank? I understand that it has not been very effective. Why is this?
I have a response, but any question, anybody from Philadelphia available to respond to this? Not sure there is. Yeah, I think I'm a little removed from the Philadelphia process. I've spent a lot of time on land banks, but ironically, mostly in central and western Pennsylvania. I know there had been a lot of dialogue during the last city administration between the mayor and city council, former Mayor Nutter and city council president Darrell Clark, about, is a land bank needed? How is this going to work out? How is it going to relate to city council's current powers in terms of authorizing real estate transactions? Don't we already have enough oversight? So a lot of questions like that came up during the previous administration and were to some extent resolved, but I think they reemerged under the current mayoral administration. Again, I don't think because the land bank was particularly controversial, excuse me, but because the issue of land transactions had been a topic of discussion and debate between the mayor, city administrations, and the city council. And I think the reason for this is because there are so many vacant properties in Philadelphia, and there have been a lot of different sort of arrangements for dealing with them. So the process was drawn out more than I think everybody would have liked. In addition, the land bank had identified as its first priority taking on this role of a clearinghouse that I identified previously, that is taking in properties that had been owned by other public agencies, the school district, the City Department of Public Property, in order to get toward creating a one-stop shop for developers so that a developer wouldn't have to go to multiple agencies in order to get title to different properties that would be needed to assemble a site. And so those transactions took a long time because they involved, the transfer of title and recording of deeds and so on. So I know that was another factor. A third factor that I think played into this was the need to coordinate a relationship between the land bank and the sheriff's office. Philadelphia is unlike a lot of other places in Pennsylvania in that it does not have a tax claim bureau which reports to the administration. It is a sheriff which administers the tax sales, and the sheriff is independently elected. And so there's sort of a special need for coordination and for addressing this issue of, which properties are going to be taken by the land bank. And that, I think, understandably took time. There is a process in place. The land bank has been acquiring properties from sheriff's sale, and so that's beginning. So that's kind of a partial answer. It is more complicated in Philadelphia than elsewhere, but there's a history there, and I don't think there's any one sort of reason why the land bank hasn't moved as quickly as supporters had hoped. Hope that's helpful.
Hey, John. Could I piggyback on that? It's Irene again from Pittsburgh.
Good.
Yeah,
Great.
I mean, I don't know what's happening in Philly, but yeah, Philly and Pittsburgh are kind of unique in that they are, these first and second class cities, and we don't have the tax claim bureau, as you did emphasize. So we're not just dealing with that repository of unsold properties that a tax claim bureau manages to the extent that they can. We are dealing with already long-formed relationships, and now there's this new kid on the block, as you described. And even in Pittsburgh, one of the things that we had to really ferret out was, again, the role of the Urban Redevelopment Authority with the city of Pittsburgh, and then this land bank. Where does the land bank fit in? And what happened was there was a recognition ultimately that the Urban Redevelopment Authority does major commercial development very well, but they haven't done the side yard sale very well, and nor has the City of Pittsburgh's real estate division. So the idea became that the Pittsburgh Land Bank really should carve its niche around what we're referring to as neighborhood scale development. And that took a little bit, even while some of the greatest proponents of the land bank were actually within the Urban Redevelopment Authority. But it just does take some time and lots of conversations in these kind of larger, more complicated systems like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh.
Hey John,
as well as people who know how to rebound, like Irene.
This is Winnie, John. I just wanted to add something about Philly.
Yes.
There's a recent Philadelphia Business Journal article about the land bank, and just to trumpet its successes a little bit, that Business Journal and Next City reported that since Philly started in December of 2015, it's cleared 6,000 titles for transfer, centralized ownership of some 2,000 vacant lots from several different public entities, and that in the first 2 quarters, of 2016, it sold a total of 127 vacant lots. And this Philadelphia Business Journal article was essentially telling folks who were interested in buying vacant lots that to do it now because the land bank's operations and increasing market strength in Philly is going to make these vacant lot prices go up. So if you have a chance to attend a Philly Land Bank board meeting, they're really helpful, and their website has tons of information on what they're doing and some of the successes they've had.
Great, thank you. Okay. Any other questions? I think we're about ready to wrap up. It's near 1 o'clock. Good. Well, why don't we adjourn then? Thank you very much, everyone, for participating, especially George and Irene. And we'll look forward to being in touch on the future progress of land banks in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. I just wanted to also emphasize again that the Housing Alliance will be having our annual Homes Within Reach conference October 29th through the 31st in Harrisburg. And we do have a blight and land bank track, and we'll be featuring a report that we'll be releasing at the conference on October 29th. So we hope everybody can join us there. And I'd like to thank John, George, and Irene again. Have a great Friday, everybody, and have a great weekend.
You as well. Thank you, guys. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you.